10% happier, how I tamed the voice in my head, reduced stress without losing my edge, and found self-help that actually works. A True Story, by Dan Harris. Introduction. Imagine this. You're live, on national television. 5 million people are watching you. You're sitting under the bright lights of one of the most famous news sets in the world, Good Morning America. You're wearing your favorite tie, your hair is perfectly coiffed, and you are the very picture of confidence. This is the moment you've worked your entire life for. And then, it hits. Out of nowhere, a wave of raw, animal fear stabs you in the brain. A paralytic panic rolls up through your shoulders, over your head, and melts down your face. Your heart starts to gallop. Your mouth goes dry. The universe feels like it's collapsing in on you, and you can't breathe. The words on the teleprompter in front of you become a blur, but you know you have 4 more stories to read. An eternity, with no place to hide. This isn't a nightmare. This really happened to ABC News anchor Dan Harris, in the middle of a live broadcast in 2004. That on-air meltdown wasn't just a random case of stage fright. It was the spectacular collapse of a life built on a very specific, and very familiar, foundation: the relentless, chattering, and often cruel voice in his head. It's a voice I think you know well. It's that inner narrator that wakes up with you in the morning, heckles you all day long, and keeps you up at night, replaying your mistakes and worrying about the future. Dan Harris had a name for this voice. He called it an asshole. His journey to tame that voice is one of the most honest, hilarious, and profoundly useful stories of our time. It's a journey that took him from war zones in the Middle East to the strange world of self-help gurus, from the feet of the Dalai Lama to a 10-day silent retreat that nearly broke him. Today, we're going to walk that path with him. And I promise you, by the end of our time together, you'll understand the secret to taming that relentless voice in your own head. Not by fighting it, but by getting smarter than it. You'll discover a practical, no-nonsense way to reduce your stress and increase your happiness, not by 100%, but by a simple, achievable, and life-changing 10%. Book summary. Dan Harris's story really begins with a simple motto, a piece of wisdom inherited from his father, a brilliant but anxious doctor. The motto is this: the price of security is insecurity. Think about that for a moment. To be successful, to be safe, to achieve anything of value, you had to be constantly vigilant, perpetually worried, always scanning the horizon for the next threat. For Dan, this wasn't just advice, it was his operating system. He described himself as a frequent mental inventory taker, always pressing on his bruises to see if they still hurt. And for a long time, it worked. This constant, low-grade hum of anxiety propelled him. Straight out of college, he dove into the world of television news, starting at a tiny station in Maine for $5.50 an hour. But he was driven. He loved the craft, the thrill of chasing a story, and yes, the deeply affirming feeling of being recognized on the street. That drive, that insecurity, pushed him up the ladder with astonishing speed, from rural Maine to Boston, and then, at just 28 years old, to the Holy Grail, ABC News in New York. He'd made it to the network. But the voice in his head only got louder. Now, he was swimming with sharks. The news division was a fiercely competitive environment, and at the top of the food chain was the legendary anchor Peter Jennings. Jennings was Dan's idol, suave, authoritative, the voice of God. He was also his mentor and, sometimes, his tormentor. Working for Jennings was like sticking your head in a lion's mouth, thrilling, but not particularly safe. Jennings had a volcanic temper and seemed to take pleasure in embarrassing his young correspondents. Dan lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, an endless mental loop. How many stories have I had on this week? What does Peter think of me right now? The insecurity that had been his engine was now threatening to burn him out. And then, September 11, 2001, happened. That day changed everything. For Dan, it ignited a new, more dangerous ambition. Covering the aftermath from ground zero, he knew that the fluffy, back-of-the-book stories he'd been doing were no longer enough. He wanted to be at the heart of the biggest story of his lifetime. A few weeks later, the foreign desk called. "We need you to go to Pakistan." A pint of dopamine was released into his brain. This was the beginning of what he would later call his addiction to journalistic heroin, the pure, sick rush of being somewhere you are not supposed to be, and not only getting away with it, but getting on TV. He spent the next 3 years shuttling between New York and war zones in Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, and Gaza. He was floating on a wash of adrenaline, completely besotted with airtime, and blind to the psychological consequences. He saw things no one should have to see. A row of dismembered legs revealed from under a bedsheet after a suicide bombing. A father wailing as he spotted his son's body being dumped into a mass grave. But at the time, he felt nothing. Or rather, he convinced himself he felt nothing. He told himself this psychological distance was a job requirement, like a surgeon staying detached during an operation. When people back home asked if the experience had changed him, his reflexive answer was no. He wasn't traumatized. He loved being a war correspondent. He loved the bodyguards, the armored cars, the illicit, energizing feeling of being in a place where all the normal rules were suspended. But the war eventually ended for him, at least for a while. In 2003, after a 5-month tour in Iraq, he came home to a pathetic, empty apartment and a personal life that had completely evaporated. And that's when his body began to send him a bill for all the horror he had witnessed. He developed a mysterious, flu-like illness that dragged on for months. He was tired and achy all the time. He got tested for everything from tropical diseases to HIV, but all the tests came back negative. Finally, he broke down and saw a psychiatrist, who took about 5 minutes to deliver a diagnosis: depression. The doctor explained that when you are cut off from your emotions, they often manifest in your body. He had 2 theories. 1. The horror Dan had witnessed was too much for his conscious mind to handle. Or 2. He was subconsciously pining for the adrenaline of the war zone. He was, in essence, in withdrawal from journalistic heroin. Unfortunately, Dan had already started self-medicating. One night, a colleague offered him cocaine, and on a whim, he said yes. He was 32 years old. The drug hit him like a triumphant horn flourish of euphoric energy. After months of feeling ragged, he felt better than normal. He felt restored. He soon discovered ecstasy, which swaddled his torso in what felt like heated cotton balls and made everything, even the simple act of talking, feel blissful. But there is no free lunch, neurologically speaking. The come-downs were brutal, leaving him a hollowed-out husk of a man. But the pull of the drugs was powerful. He knew he was taking a massive professional risk. If anyone found out, he'd be fired. Yet he carried on, his common sense hijacked by the pleasure centers of his brain. He was sleepwalking through a cascade of moronic behavior. Which brings us back to that moment. June 7, 2004, on the set of Good Morning America. As he sat there, live on air, that bolt of terror wasn't just stage fright. It was his body's final, desperate alarm bell. The psychiatrist he saw afterward, Drive Brotman, connected the dots instantly. Frequent cocaine use jacks up the levels of adrenaline in the brain, dramatically increasing the odds of a panic attack. What Dan had experienced was an overwhelming jolt of the ancient fight-or-flight response. Except in this case, He was both the saber-toothed tiger and the terrified caveman trying to escape. The doctor's decree was simple: stop doing drugs, immediately. Faced with the potential implosion of his career, Dan agreed. He quit cold turkey. But that was only the beginning. The sheer enormity of his mindlessness started to sink in. He realized he needed to make deeper changes. His search for a solution began, oddly enough, with an assignment Peter Jennings had given him years earlier, one he'd tried to get out of, covering religion. As a devout agnostic, Dan thought organized religion was bunk, and that anyone who believed, whether in Jesus or jihad, must be cognitively impaired. His coverage was, at first, like that of a tourist in an open-air zoo, focusing on the strangest fare he could find. But then he met a man who changed his perspective. Pastor Ted Haggard, the head of a massive evangelical megachurch in Colorado Springs. Ted was relentlessly chipper, with a Clinton-esque way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. Dan went in expecting a caricature, but what he found was a savvy, surprisingly frank man who didn't try to convert him and wasn't defensive about his faith. Talking to Ted, Dan realized how unthinkingly judgmental he'd been about religious people. It hit him that he had blindly bought into the stereotypes. Ted became Dan's inside source on the world of evangelicalism, his first stop for candid answers. And then, one morning, the news broke. Ted Haggard, a married father of 5 and one of the most influential evangelicals in America, was accused by a male escort of paying for sex and crystal meth. The story was true. Ted's life imploded in a spectacular, salacious fashion. For Dan, it was a professional story, but it was also personal. Months later, he did the first network interview with the disgraced pastor. What struck him most wasn't the hypocrisy or the deception. It was that in Ted's darkest moments, when he was contemplating suicide, his faith was his main source of comfort. It gave him a sense that his troubles had a larger purpose. And Dan, who had just endured his own self-created crisis, envied him for that. For the first time, he saw the value of having a viewpoint that transcended the mundane. As he put it, if you're never looking up, you're always just looking around. He wasn't about to start believing in God, but a seed had been planted. He was ready for something more. And that something more arrived in a deeply weird and confusing package. A producer on his team, a woman named Felicia, suggested he read a book by a self-help guru named Eckhart Tolle. The book, A New Earth, had a cheesy cover and the seal of Oprah's book club. At first, Dan thought it was irredeemable poppycock, a fire hose of jargon like conditioned mind structures and the one indwelling consciousness. He was rolling his eyes, cursing Felicia for inflicting this upon him. But then, a clearing appeared in the spiritual thicket. Tolle began to unfurl a fascinating thesis, one that made Dan feel the author had somehow spent an enormous amount of time inside his skull. Our entire lives, Tolle argued, are governed by a voice in our heads. This voice is a ceaseless stream of thinking, most of it negative, repetitive, and self-referential. It's obsessed with the past and the future, at the expense of the present moment, which is, quite literally, all we ever have. This voice, Tolle called the ego, and it wasn't just about being arrogant, it was our very sense of I, our inner narrator. Dan suddenly recognized this voice as the source of all his troubles. It was the voice that said, "You should do cocaine." It was the voice that was never satisfied, that constantly compared him to others, that thrived on drama. As he lay in bed late that night, it was the first time he realized that the voice in his head, the running commentary that had dominated his life since he could remember, was, in fact, an asshole. He was hooked. But just as he was concluding that Tolle was a sage who held the key to all his problems, Tolle started saying some ludicrous things. He claimed that living in the present moment slows the aging process and makes the molecular structure of the body less dense. He toggled seamlessly between profound and pseudoscientific, incisive and insane. Dan couldn't figure out if the man was a genius or a lunatic. Worse, Tola offered a brilliant diagnosis of the human condition with basically no practical action plan for how to combat the ego. His advice was to simply be aware of the voice. For Dan, that was like telling someone whose hair is on fire to simply be aware of the flames. He needed an extinguisher. His search continued. He met Deepak Chopra, perhaps the most famous guru on earth. Chopra, with his rhinestone glasses and love of the spotlight, also claimed to be permanently present, living in a state of effortless spontaneity. But Dan watched him pound away at his BlackBerry while walking down the street, and argue with zeal during a debate. He seemed like a walking contradiction. With Tola, Dan believed he was sincere but couldn't tell if he was sane. With Deepak, he believed he was sane but couldn't tell if he was sincere. He even dove into the world of The Secret, the cultural phenomenon that promised you could get anything you wanted: health, wealth, love, simply by thinking about it. He found it to be a world of dangerous inanity, a philosophy that ultimately blamed victims for their own misfortune. He was at his wit's end, still intrigued by the diagnosis of the chattering ego, but completely lost on how to treat it. And then, his wife, Bianca, came to the rescue. She remembered reading some books years earlier by a psychiatrist and practicing Buddhist named Drive Mark Epstein. She handed them to Dan. That night, as he began to read, it was like his first evening with Tola, only without the embarrassment. It became blazingly clear: the best parts of Eckhart Tolle's work were largely unattributed Buddhism. 2.5 millennia before Tola started cashing royalty checks, it was the Buddha who first came up with that brilliant diagnosis of the way the mind works. The insatiable wanting, the inability to be present, the repetitive thinking, it was all there, but without the pseudoscience and grandiloquence. The Buddhists had a name for the churning of the ego. They called it the monkey mind. Dan dove in, devouring everything he could read. He learned that the Buddha's main thesis was that in a world where everything is constantly changing, a concept called impermanence, we suffer because we cling to things that won't last. We get attached to people, possessions, and even our own success, all of which will ultimately evaporate. The route to happiness, the Buddha argued, wasn't to deny this, but to achieve a deep, visceral understanding of it. It was about embracing the wisdom of insecurity. That phrase struck Dan like a bolt of lightning. It was the perfect rejoinder to his father's price of security motto. If there was no such thing as security, then why bother with the insecurity? Buddhism had the diagnosis, and unlike the self-help gurus, it also had a prescription. An actual, practical program. A radical internal jujitsu move designed to peacefully disarm the asshole in your head. The problem was, Dan found the prescription repellent. The only way to tame the monkey mind, the Buddhists argued, was to meditate. And for Dan, meditation was the distillation of everything that sucked about the granola lifestyle. He pictured himself in a room that smelled like feet, with smug practitioners ringing bells and intoning Om. Plus, he had the attention span of a yellow lab. He assumed clearing his mind was impossible. His resistance might have lasted forever, but then two things happened. First, his own psychiatrist, Drive Brotman, mentioned that a former Harvard colleague had written a best-selling book on the health benefits of meditation, like lowering blood pressure. The hypochondriac in Dan was intrigued. Second, he read a few books about what Buddhist meditation actually involved and learned you didn't have to wear robes or chant Sanskrit. And crucially, he learned that the goal isn't to clear the mind. That's impossible. The whole game is simply to notice when your mind has wandered, and then gently bring it back. Over and over again. So, one afternoon, while on vacation with friends, he sneaked off to a bedroom to give it a try. He sat on the floor, set his phone's alarm for 5 minutes, and began. His mind was a circus. In, out, in, shrubbery. I like that word. Get in the game, dude. In, out. My butt hurts. Idea for old school hip-hop show, Rap Van Winkle. Now I have an itch. What was the best thing before sliced bread? When the alarm went off, it felt like an eternity had passed. He didn't like it, but he respected it. This wasn't some fluffy hippie technique. This was a rigorous brain exercise. Rep after rep of trying to tame the runaway train of the mind. It was a badass endeavor. He resolved to do it every day. The practice was miserable. He was beset by itches, fatigue, and a fire hose of thoughts. But it did offer something huge, an actual method for shutting down the monkey mind, if only for a moment. It was the only solution he'd found yet. And soon, he started to see the benefits off the cushion. He started using his breath to jolt himself back to the present moment in airport security lines or while waiting for an elevator. But the real secret sauce of Buddhism went by a hopelessly boring name: mindfulness. In a nutshell, mindfulness is the ability to recognize what's happening in your mind, anger, jealousy, sadness, without getting carried away by it. It's a fourth option beyond our 3 habitual responses to everything: wanting it, rejecting it, or zoning out. It's about viewing the contents of your mind with a non-judgmental remove. Dan knew he desperately needed this. He could see how it could short-circuit his habitual, mindless chain reactions, like getting snippy with Bianca because he was stewing about something from the office. This was the key to responding to life, rather than just reacting to it. He knew he needed to go deeper. So, he took the plunge. He signed up for a 10-day silent meditation retreat. No talking, no TV, no phone, no sex, just meditation. All day, every day. He called it the Zen Death March. The first few days were, in his words, straight torture, son. He was assaulted by back pain, an uncontrollable urge to swallow saliva, and a tidal wave of boredom and doubt. On day 4, his 39th birthday, he was convinced it was the worst birthday ever. He was drowning in misery, genuinely considering quitting. In desperation, he went to see one of the apprentice teachers, a woman named Spring whom he had instantly disliked for her soft, cloying speaking style. But when he confessed his struggle, she dropped the funny voice and spoke to him like a normal person. "You're trying too hard," she said. "It's the opposite of daily life, where we do something and expect a result. Here, it's just about sitting with whatever is there." That simple piece of advice changed everything. He went back to his room, sat down, and decided to just lower the volume, to stop straining so much. And a few minutes in, something clicked. He fell into a state the Buddhists call choiceless awareness. It was like, after days of trying to tune a radio, he finally found the right frequency. His mind just started letting its focus fall on whatever was most prominent. Neck pain. Knee pain. Airplane overhead. Bird song. Breeze on my forearm. He wasn't trying, it was just happening. It was like he had a front row seat to watch the machinery of consciousness, the objects arising and passing with incredible speed. And the act of being present in this way produced a gigantic blast of serotonin. He felt like he'd spent 5 days being dragged behind a motorboat and had suddenly popped up on water skis. The high only got more exquisite. During a compassion meditation, where he was instructed to picture loved ones and send them well wishes, he was overcome by a silent sob. Tears streamed down his face, pooling behind his ears. When he walked out of the hall, he was crashing on waves of bliss. Everything was bright, crisp. It was, he said, the best high of his life, 1,000 times better than drugs. The retreat taught him the most valuable lesson of all. It came during a condo when he challenged the teacher, Joseph Goldstein, about the need to worry about real-world problems. Goldstein's answer was simple. He said it's fine to worry, to plan, to think about the future. But when you find yourself running through the same worry loop for the 17th time, you should ask yourself one simple question: is this useful? Is this useful? It was the perfect, elegant corrective to his father's old motto. It was the tool he needed to tame his impulse to overthink without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. When Dan returned to the real world, he found a way to talk about his new practice without sounding like a cult member. When friends asked him about it, he'd just say, "It makes me 10% happier." It was the perfect slogan, catchy, true, and it counter-programmed against the over-promising of the self-help industry. But integrating this new perspective with his ambitious career wasn't easy. His newfound calmness started to look like passivity. He stopped fighting for the big assignments. His wife, Bianca, thought he was being a wuss. The final wake-up came from his new boss, Ben Sherwood, who looked him dead in the eye during a meeting and said, "Stop being so zen." Dan realized he had confused letting go with going soft. That night, he met with his friend, Drive. Mark Epstein, who gave him another piece of crucial advice: hide the zen. He explained that it was possible to compete aggressively, to be someone to contend with, while deep inside, remaining calm. The final piece of the puzzle was the concept of non-attachment to the results. Striving is fine, Mark explained, as long as it's tempered by the realization that the final outcome is out of your control. Do everything you can to succeed, but don't be attached to the outcome. That way, if you fail, you will be maximally resilient, able to dust yourself off and get back in the fray. This was it. The Holy Grail. The marriage of the price of security and the wisdom of insecurity. Dan Harris had finally found his framework, a holistic answer for how to be a happier, better person without becoming ineffective. He codified it in a list he called The Way of the Warrior, a set of 10 precepts for the modern corporate samurai. It included principles like don't be a jerk, when necessary, hide the zen. The price of security is insecurity, until it's not useful, and of course, meditate. In the end, he realized the voice in his head is still, in many ways, an asshole. The difference is that mindfulness now does a pretty good job of tying that voice up and putting duct tape over its mouth. He's still a hard worker, still believes in a healthy amount of neuroticism. But he now knows that widening his circle of concern beyond his own crap is what truly makes him happy. Commentary. Dan Harris's journey is so powerful because it's so deeply relatable. Most of us will never have a panic attack on live television, but we all know that feeling of being hijacked by our own minds. We all have that inner critic, that relentless warrior, that monkey mind that swings from branch to branch, never settling down. What this book teaches us, with such refreshing honesty and humor, is that you don't have to be a prisoner of that voice. You can, in fact, learn to relate to it differently. And the way you do that is not through some mystical, magical transformation, but through a simple, practical, and sometimes very difficult exercise. The most profound lesson here is that happiness isn't something that just happens to you. It's not a matter of luck, or getting that promotion, or finding the perfect relationship. As the science is now showing, happiness is a skill. It's a skill you can train, just like you train your body at the gym. Your brain isn't fixed, it's constantly changing in response to your experience, a concept called neuroplasticity. And meditation is the most direct way to take the reins and sculpt your brain for the better. But perhaps the most liberating idea in 10% Happier is the one right there in the title. It's the idea that you don't need to aim for a state of perpetual bliss. You don't need to become a blissed-out zombie, as Harris feared. You can keep your ambition, your edge, your drive. The goal is simply to get a little bit better, to suffer a little bit less, to be a little less of a jerk to yourself and others. A 10% improvement might not sound like much, but when you apply it to your baseline level of well-being, day after day, it compounds into something truly life-changing. If you're curious about putting some of these ideas into practice, here are a few simple things you can try today. First, just try to notice the voice. For the rest of the day, see if you can catch that inner narrator in the act. Notice when it's judging, when it's worrying, when it's complaining. You don't have to do anything about it. Just acknowledging that it's there, and that it isn't you, is a huge first step. Second, try meditating for just 5 minutes. That's it. Sit in a chair, keep your back straight, and for 5 minutes, just try to feel the sensation of your breath. When your mind wanders off, and I promise you, it will wander, the goal isn't to get frustrated. The whole practice is just in that moment of realizing you're lost, and then gently, without judgment, starting over. And finally, the next time you find yourself stuck in a loop of worry, ask yourself that simple, brilliant question: is this useful? You'll be surprised how often the answer is no, and how that simple recognition can break the spell. That was a look inside 10% Happier by Dan Harris. We've journeyed through the core of his story today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only show you the map. The real treasure is found when you walk the path yourself. The magic happens in the quiet moments of reading, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is your guide to decide if this book is worth your time and attention. If anything we've talked about has sparked a light in you, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning new ideas, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you relate to the voice in your head, and to your entire life. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and want to continue exploring life-changing books with us, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It lets us know we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next journey into another incredible book. Let's keep growing together.